Welcome back, and we're going to continue on with our discussion on Biosphere. This is Geology 6351, Mapping and Cartography. And this is part two of a three-part coverage of the Biosphere. You might recall from part one that we had talked about ecosystem stability and biodiversity, and we had shown some examples of ecosystems before and after a disturbance. So stable means that it might be constantly changing but not diverging greatly from its original state. And a resilient ecosystem is one that can recover from a disturbance. And so these are examples here of resiliency. They had an abrupt major change and creating great instability. And then a measure of their ability to recover is resilience. So when we look at the concept of biodiversity, and that is including all ecosystems around the world, and how does biodiversity contribute to stability? Well, in general, the more biodiverse an ecosystem is, the more stable it is. And biodiversity can mean a variety of species and a variety of interactions among those species. So think of the food webs that we looked at before, which were very simple. And the more complicated a food web is, or the flow of energy in a system, the greater chance it has, or the more stability it has for surviving upsets or things that might limit a particular part of that resource. But biodiversity is on the decline. Human activities have a great impact on the number of species in the world. We are experiencing habitat loss, degradation, and fragmentation of habitats or patchiness at an unprecedented rate. Human populations are encroaching upon wild spaces and wild places, causing all of these things to happen. We are also having air, water, and soil pollution because of human activities. In general, especially in the developed nations of the world, we have an unsustainable resource use. Things are being consumed in a way that the earth is not able to handle. The systems are collapsing. We have human induced climate change, which we will cover in a future lecture, and we have human induced introduced invasive species. An invasive species is something that is not native to the area, and it comes into an area and it can wreak havoc on an area because it doesn't have a strong system of predators or controls. If we look at this map of a global representation of the number of species, we can see the higher values are represented down here in the color bar in the reds and the oranges. And then the areas with lower number of species are shown in blues. So you would consider blue areas to have lower biodiversity, lower numbers of species, and then the red areas and yellow areas have higher. If you look at this map for a moment, you should see some worldwide patterns. So if I were to ask you to describe what areas of the world show the highest biodiversity, you could explain that based on data of number of species, it looks like we have a very, very strong representation in these equatorial areas of the world. And we know that this part of South America and this part of Africa are characterized by very dense, thick tropical forests. And those types of ecosystems tend to have very, very high biodiversity. Whereas as we move closer to the poles, we see a decrease if we are matching the color bar in this map. And then in Antarctica and in the Arctic, we would have the lowest representation of biodiversity on the planet. Going over here to Australia, we also have most of the continent of Australia is characterized by a relatively low number of species. This, in and of itself, is not an indication of a planet in trouble. Some climates just lend themselves to the support of more species. Our example of a tropical rainforest, for example, has a lot of sunlight, it has a lot of precipitation, and the combination of those two factors provides a lot of resources. It also has a very complex system of trees and many, many niches. So the species are not limited by occupying the same space of land. And so you can imagine in a tree canopy that exists in the tens of meters up to 100 feet tall, that there are a lot of ecological niches possible. So if we look now at the idea of restoration and ecosystem restoration in particular, amphibians are particularly vulnerable to change and to upsets in ecosystem stability. Returning predators play a key part in ecosystem restoration, and we also can see a resurgence in some areas. So, for example, there have been increasing species shown in prairie regions in the United States. So, these are all specific examples. Let's look at the diagrams comparing and showing bad land management with ecosystem restoration. So this is showing you examples of deforestation, which is removing large numbers of trees from a particular area. Industrial agriculture is very bad for land management because you tend to have farmers that plant the same crops in the same areas year after year. That really depletes the soil of certain key nutrients, and removing all of the grasses and smaller vegetation of an area to plow a field, for example, creates erosion and dust problems as well as water balance problems. We have overgrazing. This is a definitely an issue in the United States, but it is also an issue in many relatively rural areas, and a lot of Africa is experiencing overgrazing problems as people are raising more animals to feed a growing population. All of these factors lead to a loss of biodiversity, and ultimately, we're seeing climate change in terms of loss of soil carbon, and ultimately, this relates to loss of livelihoods. With an ecosystem restoration approach, we can try to look at ways of managing using erosion control, being mindful of losing topsoils to water and to wind. We can look at soil restoration, which is replenishing the soil using non toxic means, and replanting is very valuable. I mentioned before, and I'll mention again, if this is an area that's of interest to you, I encourage you to read about the Greenbelt movement and Wangari Maathai and the work she did in Kenya. So, what happens if we are paying attention to soil and water cycles and attempting to reverse desertification? Well, we end up with intact ecosystems. We sustain livelihoods. And the promise being set forth by some scientists is that we can revert the climate change that we have experienced in our lifetimes. If we look at this map, we're looking at the comparison of two data sets. So we have points and we have polygons. And with our points, we're looking at threatened and climate change susceptible areas. And so we can see a pattern jumping out. The darker colors indicate more threat and more susceptibility to climate change. And that means that the area is going to be impacted the most by smaller changes. And the top areas of the world are going to be here in the Amazon and parts of Central America and some other parts of the world, including Europe and Asia. Not Europe, I'm sorry, Asia. And if we also look at the data set of areas that are not threatened and climate change susceptible, we are seeing a great deal of South America is not threatened and parts of Africa are not threatened. Now, I can think of a third data set that I would want to look at that would be really interesting to compare with this kind of ecosystem stability and biodiversity, and that would be human population. And I know from my experience that a lot of the areas of South America and Africa that are shown here as being not threatened and climate change susceptible, part of that is due to very, very, very low population density. Now, that's not the only factor, okay? It's not the only, this is a very complex idea with complex evaluation. So remember, I talked before about models are always simplified. Um, and any data set that you display is one small sector of a very complex reality, right? But this is how we learn about the world, and it gets us to asking more questions. Let's think about management, solutions, and modeling, and how if we look at this data and we plot biodiversity, and we're looking at historical records here, and then maybe some more relatively current, and then projections out into the future. And so historically, there is definitely a decline in ecosystems. And there was not a great focus on the management of ecosystems, believe it or not, prior to the 1970s. If you're interested in this, you can research the history of Earth Day and different kinds of things that started to get people to be aware of resource consumption. Because before the 70s, our technology and our population were of such a nature that we really didn't think as a society. I was very young, but there wasn't a great concern for exhausting resources. It just didn't seem like something that would ever happen. And in fact, there used to be a very common practice of dumping pollution right into the ocean because everyone thought the ocean can just handle it and process it. So things have changed, and we saw a resurgence of, an insurgence of conservation efforts and a focus on more sustainable production and more sustainable consumption. And so we've also seen a big push as we get here in the near 2020 of increased conservation efforts. And so it's projected that based on society's interests, and you are taking this class, so you're probably in your future going to be a key player. Hopefully, maybe you won't, but if you are, these models are showing that there is the possibility of going from a situation that we have here and then increasing it. And if we don't, then business as usual is this gray, intentionally looking very dismal situation, and it will just keep getting more and more desertified with loss of species, alterations of water patterns, etc. And so these are just different ideas representing the different amount of input and the different change that could happen. Just a review here of that trophic cascade effect. And so helping you to understand, this is kind of in reaction to a very common question. I don't know if it's common anymore, but so who cares if we lose a three-spotted or three-toed frog from a remote area in Brazil? Okay, that's a common thing that is asked, and the comparison has often been made very strongly in the United States for why should we care about the loss of species? And a very common popular politician, um, one of the Bush presidents, and he was stating in the 1970s and 1980s that there was no need to be so vigilant about protecting the spotted owl in Oregon, for example, because if we really focus on protecting this owl, we're going to lose jobs and our economy is going to collapse. And that was a very extreme example that got people riled up about, yeah, why should we care? So it isn't that black and white, certainly. And if we think about the transfer of energy through a system and looking at this energy pyramid, we can see that it is complicated, but it's not just the loss of one species, right? So if, for example, we were looking at a system and all of the rabbits were over harvested for making keychain rabbit foots, kind of a ridiculous example, but let's say it happened. Well, it's not just going to affect these primary consumers, right? The grass is going to be altered because now we no longer have strong grazing on it. And certainly the secondary consumers and tertiary consumers, if they're not able to switch to another resource of food, they're going to be affected as well. Here is a representation of a trophic cascade and an example of the recovery of an ecosystem that actually happened in 1995 because of the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone. So without the wolves, they were culled and they were removed in the early 1920s to the 1990s. There were an absence of wolves. And what happened with the environment is the aspens didn't reach full height because they were being overgrazed by the elk. The coyotes increased in great numbers without the wolves as competition. And they were preying heavily on small mammals such as foxes, badgers, and birds of prey. So, if you can know anything about these animals, just thinking about, for instance, the role that a beaver plays in an ecosystem and the effect that they have on a riparian system, and the dams that they make are very important actually for contributing to the flow of water through an ecosystem. And then again, we have the elk down here, and they were also overgrazing some of the plants. So there was an imbalance that just continued and just um, was a trophic effect. It just cascaded. Well, with the reintroduction of wolves, the elk population went to half of its size, and the stream sides, as you can see here by this picture, started to rebound with a greater diversity. And we already know that increased biodiversity means increased health resilience of an ecosystem. We had number of bison increase because there were fewer elk. There were pronghorn numbers that increased, probably because of fewer coyotes. And the beavers were creating ponds that were helpful for the flow of water and also for sometimes the stop of the flow of water. And this created that habitat and nursery area for fish, amphibians, insects, birds, and mammals. And again, because wolves don't bury their kills, there was more food available for scavengers such as eagles, ravens, magpies, and bears. And so we also had a better habitat for frogs, birds, and fish. Okay. If we think about biodiversity as a number of different species, it reflects an interaction of the living organisms and the non-living components of the biosphere over time. In general, biosphere is defined as being from below the ocean floor to about 8 kilometers into the atmosphere. And it's the living part of the world where organisms can survive. Biogeography takes into account distribution of plants and animals over time and looks at the biosphere as it changes through space in a geographical fashion and also in time with a temporal component. An ecosystem ranges in size from a pond to a city park to a large forest or desert. Ecosystems are self-sustaining collaborations of living plants and animals and also includes their non-living physical environment. The abiotic components are non-living, and this includes not only temperature and precipitation, but rocks, soil, and other types of non-living components like nutrients that are important in the environment. And then the biotic components are the organisms themselves. Here's an example of a very different ecosystems. Starting in the upper left, we have the tropical savanna in Africa, and very rich in vegetation. We also have an example of a temperate grassland. You can see that the mammals grazing in this grassland are a little bit different, and the vegetation is different, but we also see a good variety in this type of ecosystem. And the Arctic tundra, despite what most people believe, is actually pretty biodiverse. It is less biodiverse than, say, a tropical savanna or a temperate grassland, but there is quite a wide variety of plant life, and there are several types of animals that can live in the Arctic tundra. And then at the bottom here, right corner, we have a temperate marsh. So marsh is considered to be a wetland, and we have a lot of biodiversity in marshes and also really important functions for the migration of many bird species. Okay, kind of a review. So we're again looking at the flow of energy and the nutrient cycle. So we have primary producers, consumers, decomposers, and the point of this review is I want you to start thinking about ecosystems are open systems, and we divide the earth up into Köppen climate classifications, and we've looked at divisions of different ecosystems and biosphere and biome and communities and down to species and individual. But in reality, ecosystems are fluid and oftentimes will interact in very complex ways. So let's just take one example. If pollution is produced in a city in Los Angeles, it's going to affect more than just the area where it's produced, because that air is going to be moving through the atmosphere and it can affect a lot of areas. A second example, thinking about ecosystem. Dust that is created in sub-Saharan Africa actually reaches all the way across the Atlantic into land areas of the Caribbean and even the east coast of the United States. So ecosystems can interact with each other, and they're not just a contained or closed system. Here's an example of a very rich biotic and abiotic combination of ingredients in a rainforest in Costa Rica. Here we have that lichen that we talked about, which is really a superorganism. And moss is also able to live in this Arctic climate. And this example below shows another very rich and biodiverse area, which is a coral reef system. Almost all energy comes from the sun. There is some breakdown of sulfur or other types of energy sources that really refers to hydrothermal vents. But for the most part, most ecosystems do rely ultimately on the sun. Through the process of photosynthesis, we have the conversion of CO2, water, and light into carbohydrates and oxygen. There's the equation. H2O is water, CO2 is carbon dioxide. Add them together with light energy from the sun, and plants will produce sugars and oxygen. C6H12O6 is the chemical notation for sugar, it's a carbohydrate. And oxygen is also a byproduct of photosynthesis. The chloroplasts are the light sensitive structures in cells. They contain green pigment and chlorophyll. So plants store energy as sugar and other carbohydrates for later use at night, and the plants consume carbohydrates through respiration. Now, I know this isn't a biology course, and this is one of those reference documents that I want you to just have an appreciation for the process. It is not the main focus of the class, but it's important background information, especially if we want to look at things like land cover change and understand energy flow in an ecosystem. So respiration is a process where plants break down carbohydrates with oxygen, and they release CO2, water, and energy. This equation hopefully looks familiar in a backwards way from the one that we just saw. And now in the process of respiration, we're breaking down the sugars and we're using that oxygen in order to produce the water, the CO2, and the energy. So plants do produce a small amount of CO2, but they are consuming a large amount of CO2 as well. This is very critical. Respiration and transpiration is the movement of water through a plant system is very important for the balance of life on Earth. There's a difference between photosynthetic production of carbohydrates and the loss of carbohydrates, and that is net photosynthesis. So it is that if you think about those graphs where we saw the amount of energy available in a system in a trophic level. So this is one of the ways that scientists approach that measuring of the amount of energy available. Here's a plant that is doing its job of photosynthesis during the day. We have light coming into the leaf of the plant, and then respiration occurs mostly at night. Uh, Kind of a cool scanning electron microscope view of a plant. The structures that do the photosynthesis work are the chlorophyll, and then we have veins which are moving and transporting those byproducts, mostly the sugars. And then this is a stoma, and the stoma open and close to regulate gases. Okay. One of the things that you can look at on a map is net primary productivity. And so this is the net photosynthesis for an entire ecosystem. It's abbreviated NPP, and it's understood to be the amount of energy captured and stored by an ecosystem. Biomass is the total weight of the organic matter in an ecosystem, and NPP tends to be highest between the tropics and decreases with higher latitudes and elevations. This is what it will look like on a map. So again, it's highest in the tropics. It decreases as we move towards the poles. Concentration here around the equator. We have a decrease in general as we go to the poles. Now, there is a big spike in primary productivity due to the forests of Europe and also the forested areas of Asia. And you can see most of Brazil is forest, as is the equatorial region of Africa. So large amounts of primary productivity. And then our color bar shows us that the areas of the yellows and light greens show lower net primary productivity. This is a good base measure for understanding where energy sources are available on the planet. When we think about an ecosystem in terms of sustainability, so now we're going to switch gears and we're looking at the human idea of what are we going to do in order to manage humanity and our use of the natural world? So we're inextricably linked. We need this planet to live. There's a growing appreciation for the importance of this fact in that poverty and caring for humans can't just be considered to be a social issue or political issue. And the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment by the United Nations in 2005 developed a lot of ways to look at the world and the complex concepts that are necessary for understanding how sustainable development can be achieved. One of the primary pillars, and depending upon which model you look at, there are either 8, 12, or 16. And in all of the models that are used for assessment by the United Nations, the ecosystem is a component. And the millennial ecosystem says we need to remember an ecosystem is a dynamic complex of plant, animal, and microorganism communities. Combined with the non-living environment, there is an interaction that we define as a functional unit. Ecosystem services, then, are the benefits people obtain from ecosystems. And they are critical for the well-being and sufficiently diverse, and they need to be sufficiently diverse and numerous enough to classify into 4 major categories. Please ignore this reference of a page. This was a slide that I used when I used to assign a textbook that you needed to buy, so don't worry about that, but this is the reference that I want you to use for this. So these are the 4 major categories. First one is provisioning, and we're looking at actively harvesting the natural world. Man does this primarily for food, water, timber, and fiber. The second category of an ecosystem service is regulating. And these are the things that control key physical and biological elements of our environment. I want you to think about climate regulation, flood regulation, disease regulation, and water purification. So you might think of this one as how do we manage the earth systems and the processes that affect how we live. Third is cultural, and these are aesthetic and spiritual values we place on nature. And it also includes educational and recreational activities dependent on ecosystems. It's very tempting if you are conservation minded to say, I want to establish a marine protected area and no one can fish and no one can utilize this area because we need to protect it from human influence. However, culture says that not every nation, certainly not every state, is going to approve all of their waters to be marine protected areas. And it isn't practical either because you still need to have areas to fish. And the idea is blending in cultural services with the need to address the first and second categories we've talked about here. And then finally, supporting ecosystem services are biogeochemical cycles. These are the biological and physical processes that drive ecosystem function, including soil formation, nutrient cycling, and photosynthesis. They may not be things that non scientific people think about that much, or for instance, if you're not a farmer, you may not think about nutrient cycling that much, but these are a very important part of looking at an ecosystem and how to manage it. As we saw in food webs, you can see that the relationships are very complex. I'm not going to go through all of these arrows. I just want you to appreciate that there's been a lot of study on the potential for mediation. So dark arrows represent high potential for mediation of socioeconomic factors, and then lighter arrows represent low potential for the mediation of those factors. So, for instance, if we are to look at a provisioning component of an ecosystem service, be it food, fresh water, wood, and fiber, if we are making the connection for the constituents of well being and using these things for a good livelihood, sufficient and nutritious food, shelter, and access to goods, there is a high potential for mediation of this relationship with a socioeconomic factor. On the other hand, if we also consider provisioning, and we're considering the same factors, this arrow here is showing us that there's a low potential for mediation with socioeconomic factors in terms of social cohesion, mutual respect, and ability to help others. And so just approaching something from a socioeconomic standpoint doesn't always lead to good social relations. And so you can appreciate that business and politics can be very complicated when you're approaching the same problem and the same issue. I also want you to look and see that the width of the arrow is also indicating how strong that linkage is. And so we have a very strong linkage, for example, between provisioning and health. And then it is a weaker linkage between, let's say, regulating and social relations. So it doesn't mean that the linkage is not that important. It might just not be directly linked, and it may not be that intense. So, lot to take in here on this slide. This is the kind of slide that I will ask you an exam question about. It will be a thinking question. You are encouraged, and I hope that you use all of your slides and resources on your exams. So I will ask you to revisit this, but I'm going to ask you to do some deeper thinking that goes beyond our lecture time, especially because we're doing recordings. If we were in a classroom together, this is where I would stop talking at you and we would have a discussion or we would do an activity. So that will come in the future, but let's move on for now. And I want to go into the biogeochemical cycles and the flow of energy in an Earth system. So, with nutrients, these are chemicals that are essential for life. The most essential nutrients on Earth are hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon. In fact, they make up 99% of Earth's biomass. So, key chemicals will move through these cycles, and they're defined as biogeochemical cycles. So, we have physical and chemical processes that control the composition of our atmosphere. And we have the input of sun's energy, and this is representing a portion of sun's energy that is defined as ultraviolet light, and it has an effect in terms of oxidation chemistry, and it is going to affect the gases in our atmosphere. So these gases are transported through the processes of advection, convection, and turbulence. And advection has to do primarily with vertical movements through the atmosphere. Convection is more of a horizontal movement, and then turbulence is the general mixing and instability of atmospheric processes. So we have UV light, which is operating on these gases, and then we get cloud chemistry and washout. So we get a mixing of our atmosphere into long and short lived greenhouse gases and particles, as well as secondary air pollution. All of that process is not just pollution, but this part of the graph is considering, well, if it does come from pollution, how is that contributing to the composition of our atmosphere? This is the science that we just covered at the top. Also, we have more science of nitrogen cycle and carbon cycle. So these are not independent of each other, but we're just considering them a little bit at a time. We're chunking it out. After we have these emissions and primary air pollution, we get the nitrogen cycle is affected because of the deposition, acidification, and eutrophication that is caused or driven, I should say driven, by nitrogen. And so we can see here that we've got some agriculture, which is definitely affecting the loss of nitrogen from this land source. And we will have nitrogen in this pond system, which an influx of nitrogen from soil particles can lead to a phenomenon known as eutrophication, where all of a sudden there's an influx of nitrogen, and so the food web is infused by these nutrients, and so your plants and your algae and the floating plants called phytoplankton bloom or explode, and then there is a die-off of other organisms because as these plants and algae die, which they do, but now because their population has exploded, when they die, they consume a lot of oxygen, which removes that strong oxygen source for other organisms in the water that were relying on it, and then they die off as well. So that's eutrophication. Acidification, think of acid rain. And so the increase of these types of particles in our environment leads to rainfall that is highly acidic, and it can cause imbalances and many problems like the erosion of historical structures in Europe is a big problem with acid rain. And then we can also see here, not separate, it is definitely linked, air quality and health. And the presence of particles, ozone loss, and different kinds of gases in our atmosphere is problematic. So, with oxygen and carbon cycles, they're intertwined through photosynthesis and respiration, as we've seen. Photosynthesis is the main source of atmospheric oxygen, and the atmosphere will link carbon fixing photosynthesis with carbon releasing respiration in what is hopefully a continued balance. So we see here the different inputs and outputs to the atmosphere. We have our sunlight coming in, our uh, excuse me, our trees and our vegetation are doing the job of photosynthesis, which produces as a byproduct oxygen into our environment, also contributes to organic carbon stores. And the decay of organisms is very vital for having nutrients in our soil. Now, if we continue on to the right with this cycle, the dead organisms and waste products are important for fossils and fossil fuels. And we also have animal respiration that is contributing not only gases to the environment, but we also have waste from animals that are contributing nutrients to our soil. Another example of a plant, because it is doing a different process than the photosynthesis. So plant respiration is very, very important, especially for gas composition and also for water composition on the earth. So the process of transpiration is where plants are taking in air and sunlight and making sugars and water. And so they are also producing some carbon dioxide, but they consume much more carbon dioxide than they release. And then part of the cycle here, we have auto and factory emissions that are problematic. And this is all going and contributing to carbon dioxide reservoir in the atmosphere. What I also want to point out here, which is the often not mentioned in talks about climate change and CO2, is that the Earth has a natural CO2 cycle. So CO2 comes from dead and dying animals. It comes from volcanoes. It comes from the processes of plants doing respiration. So all of those are sources of CO2. The reason that you hear about man-made activities with climate change is that man's production of CO2 is not on the same scale as those processes I just mentioned. Even a huge volcanic eruption doesn't produce as much CO2 as the day-to-day auto and factory emissions that man is contributing to this cycle. And so if there were no autos and factories, this cycle is theorized to be very, very capable of being in balance. And the idea is that with these auto and factory emissions, that this cycle is going out of balance. And then finally, I want to mention that carbon dioxide as part of this system is dissolved into the oceans. We'll talk more about that when we look at climate change. There's a nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen actually makes up over 78% of our atmosphere. We tend to think of air and oxygen as being the same thing sometimes, and that's because humans need oxygen in their blood for our functioning, but air is about 20% and maybe a little bit more of oxygen. It's mostly nitrogen. And nitrogen is also the building blocks for protein. So it's a component of anything that's considered organic. And by organic, I'm not talking about the food that you buy with labels on it that say organic. So this isn't organic, meaning grown without pesticides. Organic means that it is a natural molecule and it will have nitrogen as one of its components. So nitrogen fixing bacteria is an example of one of those detritivores that we considered earlier. They take nitrogen from the atmosphere and they make it available to other organisms. So a lot of organisms will get their nitrogen by consuming peas, beans, clover, and peanuts, for example. Here is a diagram of nitrogen. And so there's a reservoir of nitrogen in the atmosphere. And again, this is a circular process. We could start anywhere. I'm just going to start at the top. And so lightning and forest fires produce nitrates, and fossil fuel combustion also forms nitrogen compounds that are washed from the atmosphere by rain. The processes of that are affecting this nitrogen reservoir in the atmosphere are fixation by nitrogen fixing bacteria, atmospheric fixation, and industrial fixation. Industrial fixation leads to fertilizers, and that contributes nitrates to the soil. Atmospheric fixation um, also contributes nitrates into the soil. And then we have the fixation of nitrogen fixing bacteria, which is putting these nitrates into the soil. These nitrates also come from ammonia, which is the byproduct of plant and animal waste. And then we have the denitrifying bacteria, which are releasing that nitrogen back into the atmosphere. So part of this component, plants absorb nitrogen and incorporate it into organic material. And atmospheric nitrogen is chemically fixed by bacteria in legume roots and soil. There's an impact of agriculture on the nitrogen cycle. So the influence of using synthetic inorganic fertilizers to soil affects this cycle, and humans fix more nitrogen to synthetic fertilizer than all the nitrogen in terrestrial sources. This excess nutrient enters our waterways, and it can feed the algae and phytoplankton, which I've already described. And this is not just a lake or terrestrial phenomenon, it is common along the oceans as well. When these blooms die and decompose, they are consuming oxygen in the decomposition process, and the oxygen levels drop dramatically, and there are dead zones or massive die offs. So, if you think this isn't a big problem, you can see here, this is off the Louisiana coast, and this entire area is regularly classified as a dead zone, primarily because of the agricultural runoff from the Mississippi River. Now, if you think of the Mississippi River as only being the main Mississippi River, think again. Everything that you see here in blue, without any names on it, all of these are tributaries that go into the Mississippi River. So ultimately, you're looking at about a fourth to a third of the United States land being part of the Mississippi River system. And or the Mississippi River watershed. So all of the nitrogen that is entering into these waterways in the form of soil and from runoff and also from wind is potentially dumping down here into the ocean. And this is where we are getting that influx of nitrogen. And so you can see that a dead zone is actually quite extensive during the times of the year when there are blooms and these incidences are happening. So it's on a much larger scale than most people tend to think of. And that's one of the powers of maps as well, is for us to visualize an environmental issue and see that this is more serious than most people will think of. For your reference, this purple area in the top map is the zoomed in area that we see at the bottom, representing bottom water dissolved oxygen measurements of a particular date in 2013. So humans are interacting with the carbon cycle, and it contributes substantially to the provisioning ecosystem services upon which we depend. We harvest about a fourth of the total plant biomass produced each year on land. This gives us food, fuel, wood, and fiber, and it comes from croplands, pastures, and forests. Additionally, our carbon cycle plays a key role in regulating our ecosystem services because it significantly influences climate via its effect on atmospheric CO2 concentrations. So here are some examples of things that we've talked about, and this is a diagram showing you the carbon cycle. And we're looking at above, below, and on the Earth's surface. And so the arrows are representing the flow of carbon, and the numbers are representing the relative amounts. And so you can see that the numbers are representing values of gigatons of carbon per year. That is the units that are being shown in this example. And not important to memorize the specifics. This again is something I would give you a question to think about. But do note that these numbers in red are showing you areas of atmospheric carbon net annual increase. These are the areas that scientists are concerned about. The increase isn't matching with the balance that you see here in this cycle of input of carbon, and the processes of respiration and photosynthesis and storage of carbon into the soil, storage of carbon in the oceans, and the way that carbon utilizes the way that carbon is utilized in the oceans and by phytoplankton photosynthesis and also the respiration and decomposition. So these net numbers that are shown in red are of concern. There is an increase of carbon into the ocean that is not matching the output. There is a very large increase of 9 gigatons of carbon per year of fossil fuels, and then there is an increase into the photosynthesis cycle. I'm going to go ahead and end here. This concludes part 2. Thank you for your attention, and we'll see you back soon for part 3.